Today's discussion is based on his 2022 presentation titled Data for Wargames, which draws directly from the research behind his book War by Numbers. In his work, Chris explores how historical combat data can inform the design, calibration, and evaluation of wargames, highlighting what the numbers reveal about force ratios, combat outcomes, and human factors. His work provides a valuable foundation for anyone seeking to make wargames more realistic, analytically sound, and grounded in real-world evidence. Chris, welcome to the show this evening.
Thanks.
So, just to start to kick things off here, I just asked if you could describe your professional background and then maybe just the mission and core work that you do at the Dupuy Institute.
Okay. Well, I am a historian by trade. I actually do not have a degree in history.
Okay?
I first came to work for Trevor Dupuy in 1987, in part because I was already in management positions, and in part because I was already knew how to assemble databases. So my first big project at Trevor's old company um, was to assemble the Ardennes campaign simulation database. And that was a project where we tried to track for every single day the strength and losses of American, German, and British units that were involved in the Battle of the Bulge for the 30 days of the campaign. And that required going into the archives of all the units and pulling it up. At its peak, that project had about 16 people working on it. So
Wow.
these were massive, these were large database projects. I later on did the Kursk database, which I also had a dozen people working on, including a team of six Russian researchers. And and so these were large databases originally intended for model validation, but these were large databases that that could be used for a wide range of material. But the key to them all is that we ended up putting together teams of people that could then go into the archives, get out the data, pull up the records, etc. And none of this, there was no internet for it to be on back then. So, um, so what we So I kind of learned to be a historian by leading historical research projects. It was the process of working with historians. Most of our staff were historians, et cetera, watching them, working with them, et cetera, and learning as I was going along. Um,
Yeah,
and then, um,
that must have been quite the experience working for being such a like a young guy at that time, working for Colonel Dupuy himself.
yeah.
Uh, so going along the lines with the Ardennes campaign and Kursk, what were some big initial lessons that you took not only from the work that you did within or for Colonel Dupuy, but from those initial projects?
Well, let me talk the curse book, seeing I've written three books on it and got a fourth one coming out. Um, the the in the case of Kursk, we got access for the first time to the Soviet military archives, and we did that informally. We ended up using retired Forensic Military Academy professors who already had access and contracting them to get us the data that we wanted. So it was the first and to date only collection of data assembled from the unit records of both sides.
Wow. Did you run into
And
many did you run into many uh like many restraints or many issues obtaining the data sets at that time or the
there was
records?
some. We ended up with a fairly complete collection of material out of the Soviet archives, but again, it was done informally. We tried to do it formally and officially, and do it with a joint research project with the Russian research agencies, but it got political, and some people opposed it, so
Okay.
we ended up having to do it informally.
So friend of a
And
friend.
yeah, so
Oh,
the
that
the but the nature of the work was such that it was going from the unit records of each unit each day and assembling that all into a database format, um, which is not, and did not rely on any secondary sources. So
oh wow.
it was all directly from the unit records.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, it sounds
And
like you definitely have the subject matter expertise if with those being your initial projects working within the Institute. I'm just going to shift gears here slightly and focus in on your book, War by Numbers. So, as I had said during the introduction, a couple years ago, you give a presentation titled Data for Wargames, and it was based on your work within War by Numbers. I was just wondering what was your motivation at that time to both give that presentation and then sit down and write that book?
Well, the book came before the presentation. So the book was published back in 2017.
Okay.
The motivation to write the book was we had done a whole series of studies over the years, and nobody paid much attention to them.
Okay.
And obviously our customers did, but after that they kind of disappeared. So you go to our website, you see about 60 studies. So I said, well, let me see if I can put all these together into a cohesive whole to generate a book. And so when you go through the book, you'll suddenly realize that we've gone into the study on measuring information advantage. We've now gone into the study on urban warfare, and there's 2 chapters on that, and there's 2 chapters on this, etc. But the whole thing was to sort of systematically go through and show what we know. Now, what we know is a lot less than what we don't know. And so when I turned this into a briefing, and it was originally done for the U.S. Marine Corps. It was a project for the U.S. Marine Corps. When I put that together for the U.S. Marine Corps, I ended up putting together a list of what we know and a list of what we don't know, which is in my actual briefing. The What ended up happening is we got contacted by the Marine Corps back in 2016, and they wanted us to basically give them a multi-day course on how to run a war game. Well, so what I ended up doing was taking the manuscript of my book War by Numbers and turning that into what was a 300 slide briefing,
Oh,
a
wow.
6 hour course. And then eventually, when Norway contacted me to come brief them, I ended up taking that 6 hour course and shrinking it down to a 45-minute briefing,
Okay,
which of
right on.
course
So,
means we have to skip a lot of things.
yeah, I can imagine. It sounds quite overwhelming. So if I get the timeline correct here, Marine in around 2016, the Marine Corps had contacted you to run a war game or teach them how to run a war game, and
Right.
then based based on that work, that what went into War by Numbers, and then
No,
the
War by
subsequent
Numbers already
presentation.
existed. I had
Oh,
already
okay,
written War by Numbers. So
okay,
it was
gotcha.
just convenient that they contacted me, and I literally took my manuscript and painfully turned my manuscript into briefing slides, which is which
Gotcha.
is not necessarily a great way to create briefing slides. But yeah, I had already written the manuscript. I had already sent it off to the publisher, but we ended up doing the original 6 hour. It was a 2 day course. We originally did the 2 day course for the Marine Corps before the book got published, and the book came out the next year. And then
Okay,
a few years
interesting.
later, I ended up putting together the summary briefing that's basically trying to shrink 6 hours, 300 slides down to 45.
Wow. So in this path from writing War by Numbers, uh, running this professional military education for the Marine Corps, and then your subsequent presentation for with data for war games in Norway. What would you say were like the key themes or insights that you learned along the way? Maybe that were within the book themselves, working with the Marines, and then finally giving that presentation.
Well, I'm not sure there was great insights that I learned in the process. At the time I sat down to write War by Numbers, we had done all these various studies. We had done 3 urban warfare studies for Center for Army Analysis. We had done 4 enemy prisoner war capture rate studies for the Center for Army Analysis. We had done an extensive study on measuring information advantage for OSD net assessment. So we took all these studies and put them into a book. It was all material I kind of knew. Um, um, so you know, I'm not sure what the lessons learned from that were. What was surprising was, of course, the Marine Corps did not have a wargaming setup. And they
Okay.
had one. They had one back in 2012 when I was at Marine Corps Warfighting Lab. I worked there for a little while as a contractor. They had a group of people who did wargaming, but apparently they had disappeared in the various budget cuts, et cetera. So by
Wow.
2016, this this uh, Marine colonel was in charge of running the white team for the upcoming war game, and he basically decided to go by to look around to who to do it, who could do it, and he was vaguely familiar with the Dupuy Institute from being at Naval Postgraduate School, so he called us out of the blue,
Oh, all right.
and that's
Fantastic.
yeah. So but what surprised me about the whole process was the fact that we were losing expertise.
Hmm.
So there was a there was people who had run war games in the past. They had disappeared and left no trace,
Wow.
and the guy was having to reinvent it all from scratch.
Okay. You wouldn't happen to know his name by any chance, would you?
Yes, I do, but I'm not going to mention that.
Okay. I was just wondering if it's who's running the Wargame program right now at
No,
Marine Corps
he's
University.
retired from the Marine Corps now.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I guess on that note, were there any like taking another step back and looking at the book itself, War by Numbers? What would you say were the key themes or insights that you brought forth going into both the work you did with the Marines and the Data for War Games presentation?
Now, the the book is a hodgepodge. So you look at the chapter headings, and the first 4 or 5 chapters go into measuring human factors in combat. And at least inside of DoD, they don't particularly like to do that. And this is part of the reason they had a problem doing their casualty estimates for the Gulf War back in 1991. Now, a lot of people who are playing commercial war games, et cetera, instinctually they address human factors, especially in the historical games. But in the end, in the end, the DoD has been loath to address human factors. So, I mean, my chapters are: chapter 1 is understanding war, chapter 2 is force ratios, chapter 3 is attacker versus defender, showing that the defender is statistically stronger than the attacker. So checking Clausewitz, shall we say, using
Hmm.
mathematics. And then chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all measuring human factors and breaking down in detail into Italy, Ardennes, Kursk, and post World War II combat. And then chapter 8's outcome on battles. Chapter 9's a whole issue on exchange ratios. And then chapters 10 and 11 are the combat value of superior situational awareness and the combat value of surprise. Chapter 12 is the nature of lower levels of combat going down to company level and below. Chapter 13 is a discussion on dispersion in combat. Chapter 14 is a discussion on advance rates. Chapter 15 is a discussion on casualties. And then chapter 16 and 17 is a discussion on urban warfare. And then at the end of it all, we get into the last 2 chapters, which is one on modeling warfare, and then a brief discussion on the validation of the TNDM, our combat model, and
Okay.
then conclusions. So part of the problem of the book is that it covers a half a dozen, more than a half a dozen, or a dozen different subjects.
Yeah, it sounds quite broad, and
Yes.
to be honest, it sounds very overwhelming from like at face value. Uh, One thing I'd just like to hone in on is in terms of human factors, what would you say were like the biggest surprises that you found in your research? Maybe things that strayed away from common anecdotes or anything that is usually taken at face value in the military.
Well, the main thing that we discovered over time is that um, is that you end up collecting 30 or more engagements from each side. You run the engagements through, you check them through, you do it. I do a simple statistical comparison in my book. Trevor Dupuy used to do combat model runs, which was a process that I was not willing to do. But even statistical comparisons of these, these databases of 60 or more engagements on each side, you can clearly see that one side's performing better than the other. This
Okay.
stands out. This stands out very clearly with the Germans versus the Soviet armies at Kursk and also at the battles around Kharkov in 43. This stands out very clearly at the Arabs versus the Israelis in
Okay.
67 and 73. And um, and um, and so we see a relative combat effectiveness difference between the German army and the Soviet army in 43 of up to 3 to 1.
Okay.
Um, we see the same relative combat effectiveness between the Israeli army and the Arab armies. When we went into our post World War II stuff, which is a lot less data, but we do see cases where the relative combat effectiveness is by a factor of 6 to 1.
Oh, wow.
And that's a number of South African engagements against Angola, et cetera. So and then the one that got Trevor Dupuy some pushback many years ago is he was saying that the Germans basically had a combat advantage over the Americans in Italy by a factor of 1.2 to 1,
Okay.
and
Interesting.
that apparently made him persona non grata in Leavenworth for a while.
And that's just due to factors such as like superior training, equipment, or
Well, we don't know entirely what makes up the factor, but quite simply, the German army had tons of experience. They had 4 years of World War I experience, and then they already were 4 years into World War II, so they were all sitting there with 8 years of combat experience. And the American army had been re- lined up and recruited and sent over from the United States. And this was literally the Italian campaign was literally in many cases their first campaign. So the fact that they were as close as they were to the Germans is testament to what we were able to do. But
okay.
quite simply, the German army had, by 43, the German army had been in the war for 4 years.
Yeah, and you can't simply replace that combat experience.
No,
Yeah, that makes sense.
but yeah, yeah. We what we have not done is we have not done a breakdown of what makes up human factors. I have been in discussion with somebody to do that project and do that as a book and look at about 8 divisions, uh, 3 Americans, 2 British, and 3 German divisions, and go through and try to analyze their history to try to see what makes up that difference. But I'm not sure I'm going to ever start that project. We've discussed it. I've outlined it, but but you're talking about a project that's going to take four or more man years of effort. I'm not sure I want to stop my life for 4 years to work on one project.
Yeah, that's quite the commitment.
Yeah.
That dovetails in well into my next question here. So going back to the work you did for the Marines in 2016 there, or I guess any work you do with when it comes to any government funded wargaming project, what do you see based on your experience as the primary barriers to incorporating historical data sets and like meaningful outcomes into government funded wargaming projects uh, and other like government initiatives?
Um, there's 3 or 4 problems. Number one, it's not supported by the U.S. government very well. So, um, number two, there's a tendency, at least in DoD, to want an answer today.
Gotcha.
and and if you don't have that answer in your back pocket, they move on. So let me give you an actual real world example. We in 1995, we were uh, we were looking at intervening in Bosnia, and so the and so the joint staff went to talk to Deputy Undersecretary of the Army for Operations Research and basically asked them, could you give us an estimate of what possible casualties would be if we went into Bosnia? And DUSOR basically came back to them and said there is no methodology for doing that. Nobody
Oh
knew,
wow.
nobody had a methodology for estimating casualties in a peacekeeping operation.
Hmm.
Well, um, the head of the Dupuy Institute at the time, Nick Kratchu, personally knew John Shalikashvili, and he said, we can do it. And so we did it. Now, what that meant is we had literally 3 weeks put together a casualty estimate in Bosnia. It was primarily based upon extensive historical databases that we had collected in our own time, et cetera. So back in 86, Center for Army Analysis funded a study called Casualty Estimates for Contingency Operations. So we took the data from that study that they had funded back in 86, and we used that as the core to build a database of operations. And then this is the olden days, so we phoned the United Nations. We got to the right office there, and they faxed us like 40 pages of material of
Wow.
all the casualties and all the various peacekeeping operations we involved in. So we ended up building this database of about 90 cases, and then did our analysis based upon this database, and we gave the casualty estimate to the Joint Staff. Shalikashvili carried it with him to brief Clinton on it,
Hmm.
and is what we were told. And then, of course, the United States made the decision to go ahead and go into Bosnia because everyone was willing to take the gamble at that point. Um, but and so after we did the estimate, of course, we thought we had broken new ground and did something rather amazing. And so after we did the estimate, we went and talked to J8, the head of the studies analysis section of the Joint Staff, and we met with him, and we got no funding and no further support. So the only reason we have even done this work was because we had previously had a funded study back in '86 that was done by Trevor Dupuy. We were able to grab some of the material, assemble all the material together, put it into a database format, and then be able to run the numbers and do the analysis. And at the end of it, we knew that there was a lot of holes in there and a lot of more work that needed to be done. So when we went back to the Joint Staff to try to get additional support material so we could refine our data, nobody was interested in funding it. So there's a tendency to want an answer right away, and um, and then um, and then when they've answered that question and moved on to the next issue, everything gets forgotten.
Yeah, that's
So
too bad.
the let me give you another example. Breakpoints. Now this is a significant hole. Um, breakpoints. The original breakpoint study was done back in 1956, I think, by a lady by the name of Dorothy Clark, and she got together about 60 battalion level um, records from about 60 battalion level engagements, and she studied and analyzed that material.
And just before we get into breakpoints, just see if you could give a broad definition, just for those that may not be aware with what a breakpoint is, or how
Well,
you
breakpoint,
define it.
it's I always use the shorthand term, which probably I shouldn't use. It's force changes in posture.
Okay.
So when you say the breakpoints, you think of people streaming to the rear, screaming, but it's force changes in posture. So if somebody is on the attack and then they suddenly decide not to attack, that's a breakpoint. That's a force change in posture. If they're on the
Which,
defense and they decide to retreat, that's a break point. That's a force change of posture. Very rarely do you get actual routes out there.
which is exactly in line with Colonel Dupuy's definition in understanding defeat. Perfect.
Yeah, yeah. So the original study was done by Dorothy Clark. She selected about 60 engagements, and the casualty rates range from less than 1% to like 90%. And the
Wow.
breakpoints were scattered across that whole scale. You can pull that study up. It's very interesting to see. And then at the end, she took an average of those 60 engagements and came up with a figure of 40%. Then she said, it's quite clear that the primary cause of breakpoints is not casualty rates. The fact that it averages at 40% doesn't mean that you get to 40%, there should be a breakpoint. And so that was the only study she did on breakpoints. Then Leavenworth, in the maneuver control manual in 58, address the issue of breakpoints for the sake of them running war games. And then they updated it in 64. So by 64, their manual had a graph with two types of breakpoints, type 1 and type 2 breakpoints, and going up to percent casualties on one thing and duration or whatever it was over time, et cetera, on the other. I forget exactly. But in the end, they basically ended up with a scale that led you to conclude at 40%, you reach a breakpoint. The studies that were behind those graphs and charts, which somebody had drawn up, we've never been able to find. We actually went over to Leavenworth at one time and asked them. Um, we have never seen any studies that do that. As far as I can tell, they took Dorothy Clark's figure of 40% and then created a graph around it.
And then work backwards.
And they worked backwards. We've never seen the study. The second study done on breakpoints was done by Trevor Dupuy, and that was in 1989. I actually wrote the proposal for that study, and and um, and he handed it over to Dr. Janice Fain to run the study, and Janice Fain decided that she needed to fully intellectually explore the issue. We spent the first year of the project doing an extensive intellectual exploration of breakpoints and coming up with a listing of 13 or 14 factors that cause breakpoints, et cetera, so on and so forth, under the assumption that this was step one in the process. And then eventually she would get further down the pike into how a breakpoint happens, et cetera. Well, that further down the pike never occurred. In 89, of course, budgets were being cut. And so she did a good start, and then the budget got cut, and we never got further funding to do the next phase of the breakpoint study, and that is as of 1990, and nobody's ever revisited the issue since then. And I can guarantee you, virtually every commercial war game out there, virtually every Pentagon run war game out there, has some attrition methodology or breakpoint methodology. And almost invariably, what they go back to is at 40%, you become either combat ineffective or you break. And the only study that ever came up with that 40% figure was back in 1956. And the person who did that study said casualties are probably not the primary cause of breakpoints.
So say the late 80s, early 90s peace dividend didn't kick in and this work continued. The first step had already been completed. From your perspective, how would you go about further determining or putting more granularity to defining, okay, this is what a breakpoint is from our perspective?
I would sit there. I would assemble a data. I've got the databases already. I'll put together a database of about 300 cases or more, um, and um, and start examining all the factors involved in each engagement. So you've got a list from Janice Fain, and that's in the Understanding Defeat book. But take all those factors and go through and code them against the engagements, including, of course, casualties, and then seeing what the patterns that you see and what comes out of it. So, you're talking about a large data collection, a large coding effort, et cetera. You're talking about a project that would require at least a half a dozen people to work on it.
Half dozen
Which
people
is
and probably quite a long duration.
2 or 3 years. You don't want
Okay.
to drag things out longer than that.
But from your perspective, would that be like I'm under the impression that that is well beyond the attention span or the timeline of like a federally funded project as it stands right now.
Well, that therein lies the problem. I mean, they would have probably, the Trevor Dupuy probably would have reached that point if we had gotten further funding, but we didn't get further funding after the first stage. And I think part of the reason he wrote Understanding Defeat was to try to flag to people that there's more that needs to be done here.
Yeah, for sure. For sure, for sure. Um, we're gonna shift gears to the next question here. And this is
Okay.
more just a broad combat or warfare modeling question. So, within the context of combat modeling, what do you believe are like the key factors that we right now we've talked about breakpoints and the lack of confidence or the lack of um, analysis granularity within that concept. But what would you say, hand over heart, or with a certain level of certainty that what are the key factors that we understand with confidence, and what do you think are the types of combat data that we have that support these conclusions?
Um, Key factors we understand: weapons effectiveness at a test range.
Okay.
Okay. That is the one factor that is consistently put into US DoD models. Now, that is different than weapons effectiveness in an operational environment.
Yes,
Test range
absolutely.
figures are very different than operational environments. What people do in a test range is very different than what happens the moment bullets start flying. Um, um, but I would pretty much say, other than that, we're pretty much not sure about anything else. The tendency is at least DoD combat models tend to run hot, and they tend to run hot by an order of magnitude. So they'll produce casualty rates and equipment loss rates 3 to 10 times higher than what you see from historical records. They have a tendency to run hot. I suspect if you took some of the combat models and ran them in Ukraine in 2020, 2025, you would burn out the entire Ukrainian and Russian army in
Yeah, for
months.
sure.
In months.
And it's
You know, and so there's always been a calibration problem, and part of it is because the only data they have that they're completely confident of, is weapon effectiveness at a test range.
okay.
And I, um, the and of course there's huge shortfalls in measuring human factors, both the relative human factors between groups of people, and also the degradation that occurs in combat as a result of human factors. Now, the British have done some work on that, and even wrote a book on it. And they were trying to compare weapons effectiveness at test ranges versus weapons effectiveness in real combat, and they were finding that there was a degradation in capability by a factor of 5 or a factor of 10.
Interesting.
And
So when you speak to running hot, how I understand that is the weapons are going to fire almost exactly, or the soldiers are going to perform the same that they would in a test environment as they do in the real environment, or there's minimal deviation, and the the casualty rates, friendly casualty rates. I get the idea that based on these studies, they come back as saying that they're going to be lower than what they actually are. And then
mhm,
at the same time, the casualty rates against the enemy, of course, for anyone that's participated in whether it be a military war game or a military exercise, are always much higher than
yeah,
like almost to the. I mean, you see the same thing. You see the same things throughout history. Like if you look back at Vietnam and the chasing the kill counts,
yeah,
um, and those numbers were greatly exaggerated. Interesting.
yeah, yeah. So there's because I knew you were going to ask this question. I had put together my notes on it, and the only thing I could think of that was you could say with any confidence was weapons effectiveness at a test range. We don't know how to measure human factors. We don't know the degree of degradation from human factors from a test environment to a combat environment. David Rowland over in the UK did extensive work and wrote the only book on the subject called Stress and Battle. The We don't know how to measure breakpoints. You clearly can't operate with a 40% breakpoint rule, but that's what we pretty much operate with in most war games. We don't know. We don't know when units become ineffective or how they become ineffective. There has not been a single study in my, now it's 40 years in this industry. There's not been a single study I've ever seen that measures the effectiveness, how a unit degrades as it takes losses and casualties. There's never been a study done that. So everyone talks about units becoming no longer combat effectiveness and degrading, etc., but they cannot find a single study that discusses that. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of suppression. Nobody measures, people don't like to measure artillery suppression. The definitive artillery suppression study was done by the UK Operations Research Group in March of 1945, based upon the operations there, and there has not been much done on suppression since then. And then you add in the whole issue of advance rates in combat. And this is the weirdest one. The tables I see now showing up in the Marine Corps War Planning manual, and also in one U.S. manual now. I forget the name of it. Those tables are taken directly from Trevor Dupuy,
Okay.
sometimes without attribution. And these were the tables that Trevor Dupuy created to make his combat model run.
Hmm.
It's not a result of any systematic study of
No.
combat. It was, he needed a set of tables for advance rates for his model, so he sat down and created a set based upon his knowledge and understanding of the subject. There's no study that produced those tables, yet they're now being quoted in Marine Corps planning factors and in U.S. Army manuals like it is some piece of data.
Yeah, I mean, like for myself going through the training system, when I look back, it's like that golden 3 to 1, 1 to 3 to 1 on the offense. Doesn't matter what the offense looks like. 1 to 3 on the defense type ratio.
Well,
Almost
my
sounds to me
first
like that.
first chapter in War by Numbers is force ratios, and there's a reason it's there. And and the reason it's there is that in the real world, in real combat, like Italy in 43 or Kursk in 43 or Battle of the Bulge in 44, nobody sits around and waits for a 3-to-1 force ratio. The average attack is done at 2-to-1 or less, and the
Hmm.
vast majority of attacks fall in that 1.5 to 2-to-1 range. And these are division level engagements. These aren't small engagements. And so if you if you look through the first chapter, War by Numbers, you'll see a full discussion on force ratios, and there's no 3-to-1 rule there.
Huh. Well, it's good to know. Um, on that note, so if you if you were, someone that was new into the building data sets for combat modeling, um, conducting this type of quantitative analysis, where would you see, like we spoke to breakpoints, we spoke to force ratios, where would you see the logical next step of where this needs to go right now in terms of analysis? Um, Maybe in relation to geopolitical events with like what's going on in Ukraine, what could happen in China. If you were a new analyst on the ground, where would you start steering your interests or your focus?
Well, my focus right now, and I've been in discussion with the people, is to try to do some analysis based upon battles in Ukraine. And that would include a significant data collection, looking at units deployed, the strength of those units, what their casualties were, what their daily casualties were, what was the casualties of the Russians that they were opposed, based upon data that doesn't come from Ukraine. And looking at the actual casualties as best as you can find the data, and trying to assemble a working collection of data and a database of 60 to 120 engagements.
Okay. And you
And
and you, and you
the reason you need large collections of data, and the reason you don't want to do case studies, is I can prove any point I ever want to make using a case study by picking the right cases. What you want is a large enough collection of data that it has some statistical significance, and as combat data is highly variable and has multiple factors, dozens of factors that influence it, you need big data sets, and you need data sets of 100 cases, or 60 cases, 120 cases. For the situational awareness study that I did for OSD net assessment, we used 300 cases.
okay. And it's interesting that you brought that up because you have a new book coming out on I believe it's on the Battle of Mariupol. I was just wondering if
Mm-hmm.
you could speak to some of the key insights that came out of your research and writing that book.
Yeah, it was pretty lackadaisical. It was they took forever to take Mariupol. They were in no hurry. So, you've got this, urban legend out there that somehow the other urban warfare is the most horrible, intense, and critical thing in there, and the casualty rates in those operations on a day-to-day basis were very low. The Ukrainians were defending, and the Russians were not attacking very forcefully or quickly, and they dragged the whole thing out for what, 8 weeks, to
Interesting.
what was basically a fight of two brigades, two defending brigades and two attacking brigades. So it was a battle of a total of four brigades, generated a couple thousand killed and among the military, but that was it. So yeah, it's an odd operation
Okay.
because they were basically waiting for Kiev to collapse and surrender and et cetera before they got serious about grinding down Mariupol. And
Yeah,
so
for sure.
they kind of isolated, stood around, they kind of continued doing probing operations, et cetera, and they slowly pushed the Ukrainian perimeter in, but Ukraine had lots of time to organize and try to prepare and organize its defenses and everything else.
What would you say were some of the big lessons that came out from your research in terms of whether it be on the Russian or Ukrainian side?
Well, I hate to reach a conclusion until I've actually done a study. One of the problems with this industry is that there's lots of people willing to make observations. An observation is not analysis. An observation is an observation. And so there does need to be a body of data collected, assembled, looked over, analyzed, and then conclusions developed from that body of data. That's analysis. So, I'm currently working on a book on the Donbas right now is what I'm currently working on.
Okay.
Same co-author as we use for Mariupol. Um, and um, and there's moments of incredible intensity, but most of the time, the whole set of operations tends to be a little slow, a little lackadaisical, not
Gotcha.
overly aggressive.
Interesting. Interesting. And I guess on
And
that
so,
note, oh, sorry, go ahead.
so if you were, so so if you were sitting around with a whole bunch of people with paper combat pieces and dice and fighting these battles out like the Battle of Donbass was dragged on for months and took a whopping total of two cities. Um, they would go a whole lot quicker than what's actually happening.
Okay. Understood. Interesting. Yeah, I guess on that note, I mean, you spoke to your study within the Donbass, transition to the act of wargaming it itself, and of course, based on my experience and working within the professional military education community, and of course, there's lots of wargaming within that. What would you say, like based on your work, whether it be recent work or throughout the years, would be some key, whether it be lessons learned or key things that you would want a military practitioner to take away from the work that you do at the Dupuy Institute?
Um, my main my main point is that we actually need to study and analyze the phenomenon of war. That's what I do. I'm not out in the field. That's a whole different business. Um, but we need to understand the phenomena of war. If we're going to build a combat model, if we're going to build a war game, you got to make sure that your war game is not built upon a base of sand. There was two basis sand papers written. One was written by Rand back in 1975 when they came up with the phrase "the base of sand," and then the next one came out in 1990, also out of Rand, where they were basically saying the basis for these games is not a solid foundation, and the amount of money and time spent on games vastly exceeds the amount of time and money that has been spent on understanding the basic nature of combat. And so they need to understand what causes breakpoints. They need to understand what is the effectiveness of artillery suppression. They need to understand what is the impact of human factors on combat. These are all, subjects that can be done with a team of half a dozen people over 2 or 3 years. can find the answers to these, but you know, you're not going to find it unless you fund it.
Hmm.
So, you know, the in the end, the one of the studies, I think the one in 1975, written by John Stockfish, actually recommended that they stop spending any money on war game development and put all that money back into research.
Okay.
So, which is a conclusion I actually agree with. Now, you know, in the real world, you want them going parallel, and you know, the people doing wargaming are doing something useful, and what they're doing, you need to pay attention to, and vice versa, etc. So you don't want to stop one for the expense of the other, but in the end, you need to make sure that that creating a proper foundation for these war games is being done, and it's being done with systematic analytical studies, which which has not been the case.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I feel like you need, like you said, you need a solid foundation
Yes.
before you start the wargaming, or else, I mean, even based on the results of those war games, those could lead you in drastically different directions in terms of force design, force employment,
Yeah.
or just your way of whatever your armed forces way
Well,
of war.
the other thing, and this is one I harp upon in the chapter in my book, and the last chapter, or the second to last chapter, War by Numbers, the whole issue of validating combat models. If you got a combat model, you need to validate it. The only thing you can validate it to is real combat, which means
Yeah.
historical cases, however far back or forward you want to go. But you know, history is real combat. Real combat is history. Um, the so you need to validate combat models. Um, Last time I did a survey of the subject, there was 150 or more casualty estimation methodologies and combat models out in the industry between the US, the UK, and everyone else. 150 or more. We actually put together a catalog of them. Of those 150, less than six had ever been validated.
Wow.
So most of the models out there running have not been validated, or have done what is called face validation, which means that somebody with a eagle on his shoulder looks it over and says, "Yes, this looks good."
Okay.
you know,
Gotcha.
you know, if you can validate your model by expert opinion, then why not just get rid of the model and just have the expert give you the answers? Be
Yeah.
cheaper and quicker.
Yeah. The old test the air. Yeah, this looks good to me.
Yeah. So yeah,
Interesting.
but yeah, when you actually look into what models have been validated, there's almost none have been
Huh.
actually validated and tested to a body of nature to show that a body of data to show that they are actually um, able to replicate. And if your model cannot replicate the past, I think its odds of replicating the future are pretty low.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, uh, before we turn to questions uh, from the chat there, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your discussion with me today. You definitely have me now questioning the validity of many things that I've learned throughout the years within my professional military education. And there's definitely a lot of food for thought here, especially in terms of soft versus hard factors in warfare,
Yeah,
and especially understanding those soft factors. It's interesting that you bring this up throughout, because I know at the next Connections professional wargaming conference, the theme for Connections this year is wargaming soft factors. So I'll be very interested to see what are the models that are discussed to to understand soft factors, and then B, how much of that is reinforced by analytical rigor and how much of that is uh, just trust me. So,
yeah, yeah,
anyways, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the discussion today, Chris. So, folks, today I had a discussion with Chris Lawrence. He's the executive director of the Dupuy Institute. Within the show notes itself, we're going to include the data for Wargames presentate his 2022 presentation, as well a link for his newest book on Mariupol, and then as well the book that we were discussing today, War by Numbers. So again, on behalf of myself and Fight Club, just wanted to say thank you. Um, Ed, if you're on there, if you can just take a peel from the take a peek at the what we have going on there for the chat. If there's any
Yeah,
questions,
I'll
or
fast them
if
in.
you have any questions, Ed, I can't see anything.
Always question. No, no, it's fine. Uh, so, Chris, how do you see the horizon of what many are calling artificial intelligence? Others, it's just large language models. Do you see that as a threat or opportunity for better data modeling in war games?
Oh, I'm on the fence with AI right now, and I have not gone through it extensively. So, I don't want to be the old guy who grouses about the new technology. But one of the things that does bother me is that they are willing to say things that are false. And so I got two blog posts on my blog of cases where I asked AI a question and got a wrong answer, a wrong citation. And so there's it does not have the ability to evaluate data and decide which is realistic and which is not. Added to that, of course, a significant amount of the data, virtually most of the data that we use for our work is stuff that's not publicly available. You have to go to archives, you have to pull up records, you have to have people take notes, or you have to Xerox them all and you have to assemble them all. And then we assemble them into databases, et cetera. A lot of the work that we've done has been very labor intensive, which, um, if people haven't made that data available, like the unit records for each unit for each day. So, we've got a database, for example, of over 700, like 750 division level engagements. And we've assembled that from the actual unit records on both sides. And we've looked at the strength and losses each day and the casualties, et cetera, and then all the factors related to the engagements. And we put that all together in a database. And we got over 750 cases in that database. AI, if it could get access to the database, which it does not have access to, might be able to do something useful with it, but it could not create such a database. It could not go through and find the unit records for 1,500 or more combatants, gather together the daily unit records and put together all the casualty data, et cetera, without somebody heavily involved in directing it and getting the data and locating the data, et cetera. So, I think it has some value in use, but I don't think it's going to replace what I do anytime soon.
Okay, the next one is probably the other end of the spectrum, which is the data that you're referring to is often um, first, second, third hand accounts, but after the fact, with all the issues of recollection, bias, and perception that warfare throws upon the human condition. So, for example, there are many regimental histories that say they were up against, a certain size of enemy receiving heavy fire, and actually it might be that they were up against a much smaller enemy and receiving sporadic fire, but it looks better if you write the enemy up to be more competent, more numerous, more ruthless and aggressive. And is there a danger that those are the data points? Not saying the interpretation of them once they turn into ones and zeros is wrong, but is there a danger we're only collecting one side or we're not getting the full picture? For example, World War II, we've got evidence from both sides. In other wars, like Vietnam, you don't have the evidence from the other side because we're not
Yeah,
there anymore.
yeah. Well, the first of all, you shouldn't be using regimental histories as your research tool. What you should be going into the archives of the nation and pulling up the day-to-day records that they wrote at the time, saying where they were, what the casualties were, what was going on, etc. You should not use their intel reports for the enemy's strength. You should go to the archives of the opposing force and go through and analyze them and pull up the daily unit records, etc. Now, the last time you can conveniently get access to unit records on both sides is the middle of 44, between the U.S. and Germans and British and Germans. After starting with July of 44, German record keeping became an issue. So, the reason that a lot of our analytical work was done based upon Italy in 43 was because that's where you could get good quality German records, good quality US records, good quality British records, and look at the actual daily unit records and compare them and contrast them. In the case of the Battle of Kursk, I had daily reports from the Germans for each day as to what was going on. I had daily reports from the Soviet Army, and they did keep records, very good records. Not as extensive as German, but still they had good records, and they were reporting where the units were, what was happening, what the casualties were each day or every 3 days, etc. The problem is once you get out of World War II, it's hard to get the records from both sides. In many cases, it's hard to get the records from either side. And if you wander into the Vietnam records, you will realize how bad U.S. Army record keeping has become. So the U.S. Army record keeping in the Korean War was outstanding. You can go through and you can see where all the units are. You can go down and see where battalions are and what their losses are, et cetera, from the Korean War. You go to Vietnam, and you literally cannot find, looking at division level records, you cannot find out what the losses were for some of the divisions, what the strengths were for some of the divisions, or anything else. Most of the records never made it to the archives. Entire divisions threw away their records. Um, you know, um, it it was record keeping was a matter of inspection up to the mid 1950s, and it was an item of inspection in the U.S. Army, and and the U.S. Army quit doing that. And of course, if it's not being inspected, nobody's following it, nobody's saving the records, etc. The Marine Corps does, but the U.S. Army does not.
Okay, next one, more to do with the hobby wargame space, which also we have a lot of people who watch this who will be interested in the data modeling side for that. Do you think there's cultural resistance to a more accurate data set because currently people have license to kind of go where they want with their design, so it feels right for them, and therefore they don't really want to see something to come in and challenge that and invalidate games that have already been designed and might be quite popular either with defense professionals or hobbyists?
Well, I've been a hobbyist, but my interest is in defense professionals. In the end, this is real stuff, and it might actually be able to make a real difference. Um, and so that's been my focus the whole time. Um, I do believe there's lots of value to war games, um, but I believe they need to be done right, and they are not being done right. And I will pretty much say up front that no war games are being done right. Um, and um, and and the fundamental problem is that DoD has not spent the money or the time to systematically assemble and analyze warfare. They have not done it. So if you go to the Center for Army Analysis website and try to find their publications from the Center for Army Analysis, good luck. It's not being done. So what is the wargaming based upon? It's based upon a designer who has read a half a dozen books on a subject and saying, well, I think this is this, this is this, this is this, etc. And so the whole process has not matured into a scientific discipline. And fundamentally, study of war needs to mature into a scientific discipline.
Yeah, I think there's a phrase we often say, which is in wargame design, plagiarism is the highest form of flattery. But therefore, we've probably got games copying game mechanics from games, copying game mechanics from games that we're using a bad data set, and therefore we're so far removed from the source or the origin source of why, for example, I need a 5L6 to break or something.
Yeah. Yeah, there is traditions, there is habits, there is people copying people. I could go into a long explanation on games on ancient and medieval combat and how they all seem to evolve from a series of games that were developed by S&T, and they all have the exact same set of flaws carried through them for now, 50 plus years. But I don't really want to get into that subject. And of course, computer games tend to be board games put on computers.
Yeah, I was going to say that my experience of a lot of the digital real-time stuff is that it's trying to sell action, so therefore movement is faster, damage is more destructive. People want to see things being taken off the board, taken off the game, casualties inflicted. They don't want a game where everyone becomes suppressed and then it's about moving forward in small bunches. So therefore you get maybe an unrealistic impression of the lethality of the modern battlefield from the video games, and then people
Yeah,
want that to be replicated in analog or professional, because what people want to, especially with educational games, you want people to engage with the material, and their reference point is something which is probably sort of privileging destruction for engagement versus accuracy.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's me rounds complete.
Yeah, sounds good. I think we'll wrap up the live stream at this point.